The verdict came before the investigation began. Welcome to Sherlock File. I am your host, Julian Whitmore. Drop your location in the comments. I value every response. Glad you're here. Let's proceed. Within a quarter of an hour, we were in a hansom and rattling westward through streets that grew progressively quieter and more respectable as we left behind the noisier arteries of the town. Holmes had drawn his collar up against the cold and sunk once more into that inward abstraction which was with him the surest sign of intense activity. I knew better than to interrupt it. More than once, when engaged upon the threshold of some difficult investigation, he would withdraw himself so completely that even the passing world seemed to lose all hold upon his senses. Yet I had observed that nothing of consequence ever escaped him in such moments. From the droop of a servant at a doorway, the mud upon a wheel, the freshness of a footprint, these and 100 trifles entered his mind and arranged themselves, as if by some occult mechanism, into order. It was therefore with some surprise that, without preamble, he said, "You have your revolver, Watson." "I have." "Excellent. I do not anticipate violence, but I have long since learned that the greatest danger lies not in the violent man, but in the man who has planned too thoroughly. You think this affair may be of that description?" "I think," said Holmes, "that our anonymous correspondent has done us a kindness in one respect, in warning us away, in revealing fear. It is a poor strategist who betrays anxiety before the game has even begun." "Then you incline to believe Mr. Carroway genuine?" "Genuine enough to be frightened. And at any rate, whether he is truthful is another matter." We had reached Kensington by then, and our driver turned into a broad, silent avenue lined with dark trees and high brick facades. Blackthorn House stood a little back from the road behind a pair of iron gates. It was a severe, dignified structure of the old school, built of sombre stone blackened by London smoke, with tall windows and a portico supported by fluted pillars. Though it was barely 8 o'clock, there was an air about the place that struck me at once as oppressive. The shutters of one lower room remained closed. The brass knocker upon the door had not been freshly polished, and upon the gravel sweep there were the marks of many feet overlaid and confused, as though the household had lately been much disturbed. Before the servant had fully opened the door, and Holmes's eyes had travelled from the bell-pull to the steps, from the steps to the man's cuffs, and from his cuffs to a faint brown stain upon the side of the inner wall. "Mr. Edmund Carroway at home?" said Holmes. The footman, a pale young fellow with a drawn face, hesitated for the fraction of a second too long. "He is expecting you, sir," said he. "Of course he is," Holmes returned dryly, and passed in. We were shown not into a morning room, as I had expected, but into a library of considerable size and gloomy magnificence. Dark shelves rose from floor to ceiling. Heavy curtains admitted only a filtered winter light, so that the lamps had already been lit, though the hour was early. A coal fire burned, but without cheer. The air retained that peculiar mingling of leather, dust, and dying flowers which I have always associated with houses in which death has recently paid a visit. A man was standing before the mantelpiece, his back to us. At our entrance, he turned quickly, and I saw a gentleman of perhaps 50, spare and upright, with a clean-shaven face, deep-set eyes, and iron-grey hair brushed carefully back from a high brow. His dress was irreproachable, yet something in his expression suggested a composure maintained by effort rather than nature. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes? Dr. Watson?" said he. "I am Edmund Carroway. You are good enough to come." Holmes bowed. "Your letter was sufficiently unusual to command attention." Mr. Carroway gave a swift glance toward the closed door. "I must ask your pardon for the secrecy of my note. The circumstances are most unhappy." "And the second note?" said Holmes, and a visible change passed over the man's face. "Second note? The unsigned warning delivered to Baker Street some 20 minutes after your own letter." Carroway stared. "I sent no such thing." Holmes's eyelids drooped. Just so. The gentleman motioned us to chairs, but remained standing himself, one hand resting upon the mantel as though he required its support. You have heard, I dare say, of the death of my cousin, Julius Blackthorne. The name is new to me, said Holmes. He was the owner of this house and of some considerable commercial interests. 3 nights ago he was found dead in his study. At first it was thought to be apoplexy. That opinion lasted no more than an hour. There was a wound at the back of the head, slight but sufficient. A bronze paperweight lay nearby. The room had been disordered, and certain private papers were missing. A murder, then, I said. Yes, an ugly and senseless one, as it appeared. Scotland Yard was called in. Inspector Lestrade himself took charge. Lestrade, murmured Holmes. Then the matter has at least had energy applied to it, if not always imagination. Under other circumstances, Carraway might have smiled, but his mouth remained fixed. The household was questioned. A suspect was identified almost at once. By yesterday afternoon, an arrest had been made. By evening, the newspapers had already spoken of the affair as solved. And whom have they arrested? Asked Holmes. My cousin's secretary, Adrian Vane. Holmes glanced at me very slightly. On what grounds? On every ground, it would seem. He had access to the study. He was known to have quarreled with my cousin over some matter of accounts. And a bloodstain was found upon one cuff of his coat. A missing document case was discovered in rooms he occupied in Jermyn Street. Worst of all, he cannot adequately explain his movements during the critical half-hour. It does sound formidable, said I. It sounds arranged, said Holmes. Carraway gave a sharp intake of breath. That, Mr. Holmes, is precisely why I wrote to you. Holmes settled back, fingertips together. You are fond of the accused? No. Related? No. Then why risk public ridicule by interfering after the police have acted? For the first time, Carraway's self-command broke. Because the thing is too complete, he cried. Do you not see it? Every fact points in one direction. Every witness confirms the last. Every object discovered supports the same conclusion. Life is not so tidy, Mr. Holmes. Untruth never arranges itself with such obedience. Holmes's eyes brightened. An excellent observation. Carraway lowered his voice. My cousin was a suspicious man, hard, secretive, and not universally loved. Yet he was not a fool. If he had feared Vane, he would have dismissed him. Instead, only 2 days before his death, he entrusted him with new authority over private correspondence. That fact alone should have given them pause. It did not. You said the case was closed before it began, said Holmes. Why? The man looked from Holmes to me and back again. For a moment I thought he would refuse. Then he said very slowly, because before Julius Blackthorne died, someone in this house spoke as though they already knew who would be blamed. Holmes did not at once reply. He rose instead and crossed slowly to the window, drawing aside the curtain by a few inches and peering out into the grey garden beyond. The faint light traced the sharp outline of his profile, and I saw that expression of intense inward calculation which I had learned to associate with the turning point of a case. You say, he remarked at length without turning, that someone spoke as though the culprit were already known before the crime had been committed. Yes. Be precise, if you please. Words are the skeleton upon which facts are hung. Carraway passed a hand across his brow. It was on the afternoon before my cousin's death. We were in this very room, myself, Julius, and Mrs. Blackthorne. His wife? His sister-in-law. She has managed the household since his own wife's passing some years ago. Holmes inclined his head slightly, indicating that he followed. There had been some disagreement, Carraway continued. My cousin was in a temper, he often was, and spoke bitterly of those around him. At one point he alluded to betrayal, though he would not be specific. Mrs. Blackthorne replied, quite coolly, that if anything were to happen, the blame would fall where it properly belonged. Holmes turned sharply. Those were her exact words? As near as I can recall them. And how did your cousin respond? He laughed, not with amusement, but contempt, I think. He said that no one could prove anything unless he chose it. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Unless he chose it, he repeated softly. Very good. I did not then attach any particular importance to the exchange, Carroway went on. So it was only after his death, and after the arrest, that it returned to me with a most unpleasant clarity. Indeed, said Holmes. And this Mrs. Blackthorne, she remains in the house? She does. Holmes glanced toward the door. Then I should be obliged if you would present us. Carroway hesitated. You believe she— I believe nothing as yet, Holmes interrupted gently. I observe, I compare, and I deduce. At present, I require more observations. Carroway bowed slightly and left the room. As the door closed behind him, I turned eagerly to my companion. Well, Holmes? A most instructive beginning, said he. We have in rapid succession a crime that is excessively well supported by evidence, a suspect against whom the case is almost too perfect, and a prior statement suggesting that blame would fall conveniently in a predetermined direction. You suspect a conspiracy, then? Holmes smiled faintly. My dear Watson, I suspect design. Whether that design is the work of one mind or several remains to be seen. And the second note, the warning? Ah, Holmes's expression sharpened. That is the most candid element of all. Someone, having taken pains to construct a narrative, is now anxious that it should not be examined too closely. It is, if you will permit the analogy, like a stage illusionist who begs the audience not to look behind the curtain. And you intend to do precisely that, with your invaluable assistance. At that moment, the door opened, and Carroway returned, followed by a lady whose presence altered the atmosphere of the room in an instant. She was of middle height, dressed in deep mourning, her figure composed with an elegance that bordered upon severity. Her face was pale but finely cut, the eyes dark and steady, and her manner possessed of that quiet authority which is often more compelling than overt command. Mr. Holmes, said she with a slight inclination of the head, my cousin informs me that you have been consulted in this unhappy matter. I am Mrs. Blackthorne. Holmes bowed low. Madame, your servant. I regret the circumstances of our meeting. As do we all, she returned. There was no tremor in her voice, no visible trace of agitation. If grief were present, it was held under such perfect control as to be indistinguishable from indifference. You will, I trust, excuse my directness, Holmes continued, but time is often the enemy of clarity. I understand that Inspector Lestrade has already formed his conclusions. He has, said she, and I see no reason to doubt them. None at all? None that would justify reopening a matter so painful to the household. Holmes regarded her with a steady gaze. Painful, yes, but truth is not always considerate of comfort. Her eyes met his without flinching, nor is curiosity always considerate of propriety. A faint smile touched Holmes's lips. You put the case admirably. Yet I am here, madam, because a doubt has been expressed, one which I find, upon preliminary examination, not entirely without merit. She turned slightly toward Carroway. My cousin is of a nervous disposition. He has allowed imagination to outrun reason. I think not, said Holmes quietly. For a brief instant, so brief that I might have doubted it had I not been watching closely, a flicker passed through her expression. It was gone at once, replaced by the same composed reserve. You have not yet seen the facts, she said. On the contrary, madam, I have seen enough to know that facts may be arranged. And you suggest they have been? I suggest, said Holmes, that I should like to examine the study in which Mr. Blackthorne met his death. There was a pause, no more than a heartbeat, but it was perceptible. Very well, said she at last. If it will satisfy you, this way, if you please. She led us from the library, along a dimly lit corridor, and to a door at the far end, which she opened with a key taken from her reticule. "The police have completed their work," she said. "Nothing has been disturbed since." Holmes paused upon the threshold, his keen eyes sweeping the interior before he stepped inside. I followed, my medical instincts already alert to the lingering atmosphere of violence. The room was of moderate size, lined with books and dominated by a large writing desk near the window. Papers lay stacked in ordered piles. A heavy bronze paperweight, fashioned in the shape of a crouching lion, rested upon the blotter. Near it, upon the polished surface of the desk, I could discern a faint, dark stain. Holmes moved forward silently, his entire being transformed into an instrument of observation. He bent slightly, his gaze fixed upon the desk, then shifted to the carpet, the fireplace, the door. "Watson," said he softly, "I pray note everything, and assume nothing." I had scarcely begun my inspection when Holmes straightened suddenly, his eyes fixed upon a point near the base of the writing desk. "Ah," he murmured. There was something in his tone, a quiet note of satisfaction that caused my pulse to quicken. "The game," said Sherlock Holmes, "is already more interesting than our good friends at Scotland Yard have supposed. I stepped closer to Holmes, following the direction of his gaze. At first I perceived nothing beyond the ordinary: the leg of the desk, the patterned carpet, the dim interplay of shadow and light cast by the curtained window. Yet Holmes remained motionless, his attention fixed upon a spot so unremarkable that I might have passed it over a dozen times without remark. "Well," I ventured. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he dropped to one knee and produced his lens, holding it delicately between finger and thumb. Only then did I observe what had caught his attention. A faint abrasion upon the carpet, scarcely more than a disturbance in the nap, extending in a narrow line from beneath the desk toward the fireplace. "A mark," I said, somewhat lamely. "A movement," Holmes corrected. "Not of a foot, Watson. Observe the absence of heel or toe impression. This is the trace of an object dragged lightly across the surface. Something fallen, perhaps." Holmes shook his head. "No. The direction is consistent, drawn outward from the desk, not toward it. And here." He shifted slightly, indicating a second, even fainter line running parallel to the first. 2 points of contact, narrow, rigid, and equidistant. I frowned. "A chair leg. Too delicate. So, and the spacing is wrong. No, this is something smaller and more precise." He rose smoothly and cast his eye across the desk once more, then to the bronze paperweight. "Mrs. Blackthorne," he said, turning to her. "This object. Was it found in its present position?" She regarded him calmly. "So far as I'm aware." "You did not yourself move it?" "No." "Nor observe it being moved by the police?" "I did not remain in the room during their examination." Holmes inclined his head. "Naturally." He lifted the paperweight carefully and examined its underside. There was a faint smear along one edge, darkened but not entirely removed. "Blood," I said. "Yes. But note its distribution. It is not consistent with a simple downward blow. The stain is lateral, suggesting contact after the fact." "You mean," I said slowly, "and that the paperweight may not have been the weapon?" Holmes replaced it gently. "I mean, Watson, that it has been used, but not necessarily in the manner supposed." Carraway, who had been standing near the door, stepped forward. But the wound, Inspector Lestrade, was quite clear. "Inspector Lestrade," said Holmes mildly, "is often quite clear. It is one of his most admirable qualities. Unfortunately, clarity is not always synonymous with correctness." Mrs. Blackthorne's gaze remained fixed upon Holmes. "You imply, then, that the police have erred?" "I imply nothing as yet. I merely observe that the evidence before us admits of more than one interpretation." He turned once more to the room, his eyes now moving more rapidly, as though some internal pattern had begun to emerge. He crossed to the fireplace and examined the grate, as then the mantel above it, upon which stood a small arrangement of correspondence trays. "Watson," he said, "pray note the dust." I joined him. The mantel bore a thin, even layer of fine-grade dust, save for one small rectangular space where it had been recently disturbed. "Something has been removed," I said. "Precisely. And recently, within the last 2 days, I should say." Carraway leaned forward. There was indeed a dispatch box kept there. It contained private papers, my cousin's most sensitive correspondence. "And it is now missing?" "Yes." Holmes nodded slowly. "As expected." Mrs. Blackthorne spoke for the first time since we had entered the room. "Inspector Lestrade recovered that box yesterday. It was found among Mr. Vane's effects." Holmes turned to her with sudden interest. "Indeed? And you are certain of this?" "I was present when it was identified." "Most illuminating." There was something in his tone that caused me to glance at him sharply, but his expression had once more settled into its usual inscrutable calm. He moved next to the window, examining the latch and the sill. There were faint scratches upon the wood, old perhaps, but 1 or 2 appeared fresher than the rest. "No sign of forced entry," he murmured. "And yet—" He broke off and turned suddenly toward the door. "Mr. Carraway, who first discovered the body?" "The butler, Jennings. He entered at 8 o'clock on the morning after the crime, when my cousin did not respond to his knock." "And the room was locked?" "Yes. The key was in the lock on the inside." Holmes's eyes flashed. "On the inside?" "That is what Jennings reported. The police confirmed it." Holmes smiled faintly. "A most obliging arrangement." "You mean to suggest—" Carraway began. "I suggest nothing," Holmes repeated. "But I observe that we have before us a locked room, a conveniently placed weapon, a missing box which obligingly reappears in the possession of the accused, and a series of circumstances so admirably aligned as to leave no room for doubt." "And that," I said, catching his meaning, "is precisely what troubles you." Holmes turned to me with approval. "My dear Watson, you grow positively acute." He took one last, sweeping glance about the room, then walked deliberately back toward the desk. Once more his eyes dropped to the faint twin marks upon the carpet. "These lines," he said softly, "are the only honest witnesses in the room." "Honest?" I repeated. "They have not been coached, as arranged, or persuaded. They merely record what has occurred." "And what do they tell you?" Holmes straightened, his expression thoughtful. "They tell me that something was removed from this desk, something with 2 narrow points of contact, something that was not intended to be noticed." "A tool?" I suggested. "Possibly. Or an instrument." He glanced toward Mrs. Blackthorne. "Madame, was your cousin in the habit of keeping any such object upon his desk?" She shook her head. "None that I recall." Holmes nodded slowly. "Then we must suppose that it was brought here and taken away again." A silence fell upon the room, broken only by the faint crackle of the fire. At length Holmes drew a long breath and turned toward the door. "For the moment," said he, "I have seen sufficient." "You have reached a conclusion already?" asked Carraway eagerly, and Holmes's smile returned, thin and elusive. "On the contrary, I've reached the point at which conclusions become dangerous." "And what is our next step?" I asked. Holmes took up his hat and gloves. "Our next step, Watson, is to see the man whom everyone is so certain is guilty." "You mean Adrian Vane?" "Precisely." Holmes paused, his hand upon the door. "For it is my experience," said he quietly, "that when a case is closed in advance, the truth is most often found in the one place no one thinks to look." I opened the door. "With the man who has already been condemned." Within the hour, we had taken our leave of Blackthorne House and were once more traversing the city, this time in the direction of the nearest police station where the accused, Adrian Vane, was being held pending formal charge. Holmes remained silent for much of the journey, his long fingers tapping lightly against his knee in a rhythm which I had learned to interpret as the outward sign of rapid mental synthesis. "You are unusually reserved," I remarked at last. "I am arranging facts," said he. "One must always be cautious at this stage. The mind has a most pernicious tendency to leap toward conclusions, particularly when those conclusions appear elegantly supported. And yet you already distrust the case against Vane." "I distrust perfection, Watson. It is too often the mask of design." We drew up before the station, a grim utilitarian building whose very aspect seemed to discourage hope. Holmes alighted at once and strode within with that quiet authority which so often opened doors without the need for introduction. We were shown, after a brief exchange, into a small office where we found Inspector Lestrade seated behind a desk, a sheaf of papers before him. "Holmes," he exclaimed, rising, "I might have known you'd find your way into this. Though I must say, you are wasting your time. This one is as clean as they come." "So I have been given to understand," Holmes replied pleasantly, "and that is precisely why I'm here." Lestrade gave a short laugh. "Always the same with you. If a case is straightforward, you won't have it. If it's tangled, you call it simple." Holmes inclined his head. "A failing of temperament, perhaps. May we see the prisoner?" Lestrade hesitated only briefly. "Very well. But you'll find nothing there to overturn what we already know." "I rarely look for what is already known," said Holmes. We were conducted down a narrow corridor and into a small interview room, where a man sat upon a wooden bench beneath the watchful eye of a constable. At our entrance he rose, and I saw at once that he was younger than I had expected. No more than 30, with a pale, intelligent face and dark hair that fell slightly over his brow. His expression was one of controlled fatigue rather than fear. "Mr. Vane," said Lestrade, "this is Mr. Sherlock Holmes." A faint flicker of recognition passed over the man's features. "Then perhaps," said he quietly, "there is still some hope." Holmes regarded him steadily. "Hope, Mr. Vane, is not a commodity in which I deal. Facts, however, are always of interest. Pray be seated." We took our places opposite him, Lestrade standing to one side with an air of patient indulgence. "You are accused," Holmes continued, "of the murder of Mr. Julius Blackthorne. The evidence, I am told, is considerable." "So it would seem," said Vane. "You do not protest your innocence with any great vigor." Vane gave a faint, weary smile. "I have protested it. It has made very little difference." "Then let us try a different approach," said Holmes. "Tell me, in your own words, what occurred on the night in question." Vane folded his hands before him. "I remained at Blackthorne House until approximately 7:30. Mr. Blackthorne had dismissed the household early, as was his habit when engaged upon private matters. I left him in his study, alive and, if I may say so, somewhat preoccupied." "Preoccupied with what?" "He had received certain correspondence that disturbed him. He did not share its contents." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "And after you left?" "I returned to my rooms in Jermyn Street. I dined alone, and I have no witness to confirm the exact hour of my return." "Convenient," murmured Lestrade. Holmes raised a hand. "And the blood-stain upon your cuff?" Vane glanced down at his sleeve as though seeing it anew. "Discovered it only when it was pointed out to me. I cannot account for it." "You deny having struck Mr. Blackthorne?" "I do." "You deny having taken the dispatch box found in your rooms?" "I do." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Then how do you explain its presence there?" "I cannot." There was no defiance in his tone, no attempt at evasion, only a quiet acceptance of the fact that his position was, by all appearances, untenable. Holmes studied him for several moments in silence. "Mr. Vane," said he at last, "are you aware that your case is considered by the police to be effectively closed?" "I am." "And yet you maintain your innocence?" "I do." Then you place yourself in a most singular position. For if you are innocent, it follows that someone has taken considerable pains to ensure your guilt appears undeniable. Vane's gaze met his. That is precisely my position. Lestrade gave an impatient snort. Or the position of any man caught with his hand in the till and his story full of holes. Holmes rose. Quite so. And yet, holes, as you term them, may sometimes admit light. He turned back to Vane. One final question. On the afternoon before Mr. Blackthorne's death, was there any conversation in which your name was mentioned in connection with blame? Vane's expression changed, very slightly, but enough for Holmes to note. There was, he said. Describe it. Mr. Blackthorne and Mrs. Blackthorne were arguing. I was present only briefly. I heard her say that if matters came to a head, responsibility would fall where it belonged. And did you take that to refer to yourself? At the time, no. Now. He hesitated. Now it seems unavoidable. Holmes nodded slowly. Thank you, Mr. Vane. You have been most helpful. As we left the room, Lestrade shook his head. You see, said he. Nothing. The man has no answers. On the contrary, said Holmes, he has given us one answer of the utmost importance. And that is? That he does not lie. Lestrade stared. You can tell that from a few minutes' conversation. I can tell, said Holmes, that he does not lie in the manner of a guilty man. There is a difference, subtle, but decisive. We stepped out into the cold air once more, the fog lifting slightly as the morning advanced. Well, I asked. Holmes drew his coat more tightly about him. We are confronted, Watson, with a case in which every piece of evidence points in one direction, except the truth. And where does the truth point? Holmes's eyes gleamed. Back to Blackthorne House, said he, and to the one person who appears to have nothing at all to hide. Holmes did not immediately call for a cab. Instead, he set off at a brisk pace along the pavement, his head slightly bowed, his hands clasped behind his back in that familiar attitude of concentrated reflection. I kept beside him, though I confess that my thoughts were far less orderly than his. You are certain, then, I said, that Mrs. Blackthorne is at the center of this affair? Holmes gave a faint shake of the head. Certainty is a luxury I do not yet possess. Suspicion, however, is another matter. But everything seems to point toward Vane. Everything visible, Holmes corrected. And that, Watson, is precisely the difficulty. We are presented with a complete and coherent picture. Too complete, too coherent. It is like a puzzle in which every piece fits so perfectly that one begins to suspect the image itself has been contrived. You believe the evidence has been planted? In part, yes. But more importantly, arranged. There is a distinction. To plant evidence is crude. To arrange it is an art. We turned into a quieter street where the morning traffic had thinned and the fog lingered in pale, drifting veils. Consider, Holmes continued, the sequence of events as it has been presented to us. A man is murdered in his study. A weapon lies conveniently at hand. A suspect exists who has motive, opportunity, and, most obligingly, no alibi. Physical evidence is discovered upon his person. Missing property is found in his rooms. The case, as Lestrade would say, is complete. And yet, Holmes said softly, it is too swift. Justice, when it is genuine, is seldom so expeditious. There are always uncertainties, contradictions, elements that resist immediate interpretation. Here we have none, save those which have been conveniently overlooked. You refer to the marks upon the carpet, among other things. We walked on in silence for a few moments before I spoke again. What of the locked room? I asked. That seems to argue against any external intruder. Holmes smiled faintly. Ah, the locked room, the most obliging of all illusions. Tell me, Watson, what is required to create such an impression? A door secured from within, I replied. Precisely. And what is required to simulate it? I considered. A key, perhaps manipulated from the outside? Or placed after the fact, said Holmes. Or never removed at all. The essential point is that the appearance of security is easily manufactured, provided one has access to the room both before and after the event. You mean someone within the house? Holmes inclined his head. It is always safer to suspect proximity before invention. We had by now reached the main thoroughfare once more, and Holmes hailed a passing hansom. Back to Kensington, said he as we climbed in. Yes, you intend to confront Mrs. Blackthorne directly? Not yet. Direct confrontation is a blunt instrument. I prefer something more surgical. And what do you propose? Holmes leaned back, his eyes half closed. We have, at present, 3 anomalies. First, the prior suggestion that blame would fall in a particular direction. Second, the physical irregularities in the study, the marks upon the carpet and the questionable position of the paperweight. Third, the reappearance of the dispatch box in the possession of the accused. You think the box is significant? I think it is central, said Holmes. It represents motive, not merely for the crime, but for its arrangement. Whatever those papers contained, they were of sufficient importance to be removed, and then, most curiously, returned. Returned in order to incriminate Vane. Just so, but that raises an interesting question. Which is, why return them at all? I frowned. If the intention was to implicate him, it would be necessary. Not necessarily. The blood stain upon his cuff, the quarrel, the lack of an alibi, these alone might have sufficed. The addition of the box is excessive. You mean the case has been overproven? Holmes's eyes opened and he regarded me with approval. Exactly so, Watson. And when a case is overproven, it is often because something else must be concealed. The cab drew up once more before Blackthorne House. Holmes descended at once, his manner now decisive. Come, said he. We shall begin with the servants. The servants? They are the silent witnesses of every household drama, Holmes replied. They observe, they remember, and if properly approached, they speak. We were admitted once more by the same pale footman, whose nervous manner had not improved since our previous visit. Holmes fixed him with a keen glance. Your name? He asked. Thomas, sir. You were on duty the night before Mr. Blackthorne's death? Yes, sir. And you observed nothing unusual? The young man hesitated. No, sir, nothing that I thought unusual at the time. Holmes stepped closer. At the time, he repeated. But now? Thomas swallowed. There was only a small thing, sir. Small things are often the most instructive. I heard voices, sir. Late, after most had gone to bed. From the study? No, sir. From the corridor outside it. Holmes's interest sharpened. Who was speaking? I could not be certain, sir. One was Mr. Blackthorne, I think. The other. He hesitated again. Ah, yes. I believe it was Mrs. Blackthorne. And what did you hear? Only a few words, sir. Mr. Blackthorne said something about documents, and that they were not to be touched. And she replied, he faltered. Go on, said Holmes gently. She said, they will be exactly where they are needed. A silence followed. Holmes turned slowly toward me, and I saw in his eyes that unmistakable gleam, the flash of recognition that marks the moment when scattered fragments begin to cohere. Exactly where they are needed, he repeated softly. He looked back at the servant. You have been most helpful, Thomas. As the young man withdrew, Holmes remained standing in the hall, his gaze fixed upon the staircase that led upward into shadow. Well, Watson, said he quietly, the pattern grows clearer. You think she placed the box in Vane's rooms? I think, said Holmes, that she knew precisely where it would be found, before it was ever removed. And the murder? Holmes's expression darkened slightly. That, he said, is the final piece, and the most dangerous one. He reached for his gloves. For if we are correct, we are dealing not merely with a crime, but with a mind that has anticipated every step of its own discovery. He paused, then added, "And such a mind, Watson, does not yield easily." Holmes did not immediately ascend the staircase. Instead, he turned once more toward the door of the study, as though unwilling to relinquish a scene which, though already examined, continued to yield its secrets reluctantly. I followed him in silence, my mind occupied with the servant's testimony, now which seemed to cast a new and troubling light upon the events of that fatal evening. "Holmes," I said as we re-entered the room, "if Mrs. Blackthorne knew where the documents would be found before they were even removed, then the entire chain of evidence against Vane was conceived in advance." "Just so," he replied, "and conceived with a precision that suggests not impulse, but calculation." He moved once more to the desk, though this time his attention was not upon its surface, but upon its structure. He ran his fingers lightly along the edges, then beneath the lip of the drawer, pausing at one point where the wood seemed fractionally worn. "Watson," said he, "have you ever observed how often a man's habits betray him more completely than his actions?" "I cannot say that I have given the matter much thought." Holmes smiled faintly. "Consider a man who keeps important documents. Does he leave them exposed upon his desk?" "Certainly not." "Precisely. He conceals them, if not physically, then at least by arrangement. Now, Mr. Blackthorne was, by all accounts, a cautious and suspicious individual. It is therefore improbable that he would leave sensitive papers in plain view. Then the dispatch box was but one layer," said Holmes, "a visible repository, intended perhaps to satisfy curiosity. But the truly important material," he tapped lightly against the side of the desk, "would be nearer at hand, yet less obvious." He knelt once more and examined the underside of the desk with his lens. After a moment, he gave a soft exclamation. "As I suspected." "What is it?" Holmes reached beneath the desk and pressed against a narrow panel. There was a faint click, and a concealed compartment sprang open, revealing a shallow recess within which lay several folded papers. "A secret drawer," I said. "A most elementary device," Holmes replied, "yet effective enough, provided one does not advertise its existence." He withdrew the papers and scanned them rapidly, his expression growing more intent with each passing second. "These," said he, "are of considerable interest." "To the case?" "To the motive." He handed me one of the documents. It appeared to be a letter, part of a correspondence conducted in a careful, formal hand. As I read, my surprise deepened. "Why, this concerns financial transfers, substantial ones, and the names, some of them are quite prominent." "Indeed," said Holmes. "Our late Mr. Blackthorne appears to have been engaged in transactions of a most delicate and potentially compromising nature." "You mean blackmail?" Holmes inclined his head. "It would seem so. A man in possession of secrets is always in a position of power, but he is also in a position of danger." "And Mrs. Blackthorne, she knew of this?" "That," said Holmes, "is the question." He replaced the papers carefully within his pocket and closed the hidden compartment. "Now, Watson, let us return to our earlier observation, the marks upon the carpet." He pointed once more to the faint twin lines extending from beneath the desk. "If these indicate the removal of an object, then that object must be connected to this compartment, or to its contents." "A tool used to open it?" "Unlikely. The mechanism is simple enough to be operated by hand." "No, and I believe something was placed here, and then removed." "Placed? You mean after the murder?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Precisely. Something was brought to this desk, rested upon the carpet, and then taken away again. something narrow with 2 points of contact. I considered. A stand? Or perhaps a small case? Possibly. But note the direction of the marks. They lead away from the desk, not toward it. The object was removed after being used. And what was its purpose? Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he rose and crossed to the door, examining the lock with renewed interest. "The key," he murmured. "Placed upon the inside, a detail so convenient as to invite suspicion. You think the room was locked after the fact?" "I think," said Holmes, "is that the appearance of security was constructed to support the narrative already in place. And that narrative points to Vane." "Exactly. Which brings us to the essential question. Who benefits from his conviction?" The obvious answer would be Mrs. Blackthorne. Obvious, yes. But we must not allow ourselves to be seduced by simplicity. There is another possibility. And that is that the arrangement serves not merely to incriminate Vane, but to protect something or someone else. I was about to reply when a sound reached us from the corridor. A light footstep, followed by the faint rustle of fabric. Holmes raised a hand for silence. The door opened, and Mrs. Blackthorne stood upon the threshold. "I wondered," she said calmly, "how long you would remain occupied." Holmes straightened, his expression perfectly composed. "We have found the room most instructive. I trust it has not disappointed you." "On the contrary, madam. It has exceeded my expectations." Her eyes flickered briefly toward the desk, then returned to Holmes. "Have you discovered anything of interest?" Holmes smiled slightly. "Several things, though I fear their significance is not yet fully apparent." She inclined her head. "Naturally. One must not rush to conclusions." "Quite so," said Holmes. There was a moment's silence, during which the two regarded one another with a mutual scrutiny that was almost palpable. At length she spoke again. "Inspector Lestrade is expected shortly. I believe he intends to formalize the charge against Mr. Vane this afternoon." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "So soon? The evidence is, as you have observed, quite complete." Holmes's smile returned, though there was now an edge to it. "Yes," said he softly, "complete. And yet I think not quite finished." Mrs. Blackthorne's expression did not change, but I sensed a subtle tension in her posture. "I should be most interested," Holmes continued, "to witness the moment at which certainty becomes irreversible." "Then you will remain." "For a time," said Holmes. She inclined her head once more. "As you wish." As she withdrew, Holmes turned to me, his voice low and urgent. "We are close now, Watson. Very close." "To what?" "To the point at which the design reveals itself." "And when that happens?" Holmes's eyes shone with a cold, precise light. "Then," said he, "we shall see whether the case can still be closed, or whether it must, at last, be opened properly." Holmes did not linger in the study after Mrs. Blackthorne's departure. Instead, he drew me quietly into the corridor and closed the door with deliberate care, as though unwilling to allow even the walls to overhear his thoughts. "The pace is quickening," he murmured. "Lestrade intends to formalize the charge this afternoon. If we are to intervene, it must be with precision and with proof. You believe we are close to it?" "I believe," said Holmes, "that we are standing upon the threshold. But thresholds, Watson, are treacherous places. One step too soon, and the door closes. One step too late, and it is barred." We descended the staircase and passed into the lower hall, where the atmosphere of the house seemed, if anything, more oppressive than before. There was a stillness about it, a kind of watchful silence that suggested not peace, but restraint, and Holmes paused at the foot of the stairs and glanced toward the servants' passage. "The butler," he said. "Jennings, was it not? I should like a word with him." We were shown into a small, plainly furnished room at the rear of the house, where Jennings awaited us. A man of middle years, solidly built, with a face that bore the marks of long service and habitual discretion. He stood as we entered, his manner respectful, but guarded. "You discovered the body," said Holmes without preamble. "Yes, sir." "At 8 o'clock in the morning?" "Yes, sir." "And the door was locked?" "It was, sir. I knocked several times, received no answer, and then tried the handle. It was fastened. I fetched the key from the inside, through the keyhole, sir, with a wire, as is sometimes done, and opened the door." Holmes's eyes flickered. "You removed the key from the inside?" "Yes, sir." "And you are certain it was there?" "I saw it plainly, sir." Holmes nodded slowly. "And the room, what was its condition upon your entry?" "Much as you have seen it, sir. Mr. Blackthorne was lying beside the desk. The paperweight was upon the blotter. There was some disorder among the papers." "And nothing else struck you as unusual?" Jennings hesitated, then said, "Only that the fire had burnt low, sir. Mr. Blackthorne was particular about such things. He did not care for a cold room." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "The fire had been allowed to die?" "Yes, sir." "Curious," murmured Holmes. "And the windows?" he continued. "Were they secured?" "Yes, sir. I examined them myself before admitting the police." Holmes inclined his head. "You have been most helpful, Mr. Jennings." As we left the room, Holmes remained silent until we had returned to the hall. Then he spoke, his voice low but animated. "The key, Watson." "What of it?" "It was removed from the inside." "By Jennings himself?" "Yes. But that is consistent with the room being locked." "Is it?" Holmes turned to me. "Consider the sequence. The key is in the lock on the inside. Jennings retrieves it through the keyhole. But tell me, how does one remove a key from the inside of a door using a wire?" I frowned. "By pushing it out, I suppose." "Precisely. One pushes it out, so that it falls to the floor on the opposite side. One then retrieves it from beneath the door." "Yes." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "And yet, Jennings says he saw the key in the lock before removing it, which implies that it had not been dislodged." I felt a sudden stir of comprehension. Then the key had not been pushed out, it had been placed there. "Exactly. Placed there after the door was closed." "From the outside? Or by someone who left the room with the means of securing it behind them?" "You mean—" Holmes raised a hand. "We are not yet at the conclusion, Watson, but we are very near it." At that moment, the sound of a carriage upon the gravel announced the arrival of Inspector Lestrade. A moment later he entered the hall, brisk and businesslike, his expression one of confident satisfaction. "Ah, Holmes, you're still here. Good. You may as well witness the end of it." "The end?" said Holmes mildly. "The charge is to be laid within the hour. The evidence is complete. The magistrate is satisfied, and the man will be committed for trial." Holmes regarded him steadily. "You are quite certain of your case?" Lestrade gave a short laugh. "As certain as I've ever been of anything. You've seen it yourself. There's not a loose thread anywhere." Holmes's smile was faint, almost regretful. "On the contrary, Lestrade, there are several threads. Only they have been so neatly trimmed that one must look closely to see where they were cut." Lestrade frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean," said Holmes, "that you have before you not a case, but a construction, and a very clever one." Lestrade's expression hardened. "If you've something to say, Holmes, you'd best say it now. I've no time for riddles." Holmes glanced briefly toward the staircase, then back to the inspector. "Very well," said he quietly. "But I should prefer that all interested parties be present." "You mean Mrs. Blackthorne?" "I mean," said Holmes, "to everyone who has played a part in this affair, whether knowingly or otherwise." Lestrade hesitated, then shrugged. "As you please. But be quick about it." Within minutes we were assembled once more in the library. Carroway pale and anxious, Mrs. Blackthorne composed as ever, Lestrade impatient, and I at Holmes's side, keenly aware that we stood upon the brink of revelation. Holmes remained standing, his hands lightly clasped before him. "You have, Inspector," he began, "constructed a case against Mr. Adrian Vane which is, in many respects, exemplary. It is logical, consistent, and supported by a chain of evidence that appears unbroken." Lestrade nodded curtly. "Exactly. And yet," Holmes continued, "it is precisely that perfection which condemns it." A faint stir passed through the room. For the truth, as I have often observed, son is rarely perfect. It is irregular, contradictory, and resistant to neat arrangement. When, therefore, we are presented with a case in which every element aligns without deviation, we must ask ourselves not whether it is convincing, but whether it has been made to be so. Mrs. Blackthorne's gaze did not waver, but I saw her fingers tighten slightly upon the arm of her chair. Holmes took a step forward. "In this instance, we have a crime that was not merely committed, but prepared, a conclusion that was not merely reached, but anticipated." He paused, his eyes moving slowly from one face to another. "And the question we must now answer is this." His voice dropped, and the room seemed to draw inward around it. Who decided, before the crime was even done, who would be guilty? A silence followed Holmes's question, deep, charged, and expectant, and it was not the silence of uncertainty, but of recognition held in check. Each person present seemed to feel, though perhaps not yet fully understand, that the case had shifted irreversibly. Inspector Lestrade broke it first. "This is all very dramatic, Holmes," said he, with an edge of irritation, "but unless you've something more substantial than theory." "I have," Holmes replied quietly. He turned, not toward Lestrade, but toward Mrs. Blackthorne. "You remarked earlier, madam, that one must not rush to conclusions. I find myself in agreement. It is far better to construct them carefully, deliberately, and in advance." Her gaze met his, unwavering. "I do not follow you." "Then allow me to be clearer," said Holmes. "The case against Mr. Vane rests upon 4 principal elements: motive, opportunity, physical evidence, and the recovery of stolen documents. Each of these has been presented in such a manner as to admit of only one interpretation." "And you dispute that interpretation?" Lestrade interjected. "I do not dispute it," said Holmes. "I dispute its origin." He began to pace slowly, his voice measured, each word falling with deliberate precision. "Let us begin with motive. Mr. Vane quarreled with Mr. Blackthorne over matters of account. That is established. But such quarrels are common and rarely fatal. For motive to rise to the level of murder, it must be accompanied by something more. Something urgent, something compelling." He paused. "And that, gentlemen and madam, is supplied by the missing documents." Carraway leaned forward. "You mean the dispatch box?" "Precisely. That we are told that it contained sensitive correspondence, material that might expose or embarrass its owner. It is therefore assumed that Mr. Vane, having access to it, sought to obtain it for his own purposes." "Which is exactly what he did," said Lestrade. "Or what he was meant to appear to have done," Holmes returned. He stopped pacing and faced them. "For consider, the box is removed from this room, presumably on the night of the crime, and later discovered in Mr. Vane's rooms. A most convenient chain of custody, yet we have heard, from the testimony of a servant, that even before the crime was committed, it was known, by someone in this house, that the documents would be found exactly where they are needed." Lestrade frowned. "That's hearsay." "It is observation," said Holmes. And it aligns perfectly with the facts." He turned again to Mrs. Blackthorne. "You were aware, madam, of your cousin's activities. You knew the nature of the documents he kept and the danger they represented." She did not reply. "You also knew," Holmes continued, "that Mr. Vane, as his secretary, would be the most plausible repository for any missing material. A man of access, already in some degree of conflict with his employer, and, most importantly, without the protection of social standing. Carraway gave a low exclamation. You mean? She chose him in advance. Holmes inclined his head. He was selected, prepared, and, when the moment came, presented. Lestrade shook his head impatiently. Even if that were so, it doesn't prove she committed the murder. No, said Holmes calmly. But it proves that the murder was not an isolated act. No, it was part of a design. He moved toward the desk, as though the very presence of it anchored his reasoning. Now let us consider the physical evidence, the paperweight, ostensibly the weapon. Yet its blood stain is inconsistent with the blow. It has been handled after the fact, placed rather than used. A prop, if you will, in a carefully staged scene. And the locked door? Lestrade demanded. A construction, said Holmes. The key, we are told, was in the lock on the inside. Yet it was retrieved without being dislodged, implying that it was placed there deliberately after the room was secured. Lestrade's expression shifted, ever so slightly. And finally, Holmes said, we come to the most revealing element of all, the marks upon the carpet. He pointed toward the study door as though the evidence lay visible beyond it. And two narrow lines, running from beneath the desk outward, the trace of an object placed, used, and removed. An object with 2 points of contact, something precise, something controlled. What object? Asked Carraway. Holmes turned, and for the first time there was a faint, almost grim satisfaction in his expression. An instrument, said he, designed to do exactly what was required, and nothing more. A weapon? I asked. No, Watson, not a weapon. He paused, then added, a device. The words seemed to hang in the air. What sort of device? Lestrade demanded. One capable of delivering a blow, accurately, silently, and without the need for direct confrontation. Carraway stared. You mean, the murder was not committed by hand? Not in the conventional sense, said Holmes. The absence of struggle, the position of the body, and the nature of the wound all suggest a method that avoids the uncertainties of physical conflict. Lestrade's skepticism was giving way, inch by inch, to reluctant attention. And who, he said slowly, would have the means to construct such a thing? Holmes's gaze returned once more to Mrs. Blackthorne. Someone with patience, said he. Someone with foresight. Someone who understood not only how to commit a crime, but how to ensure that its solution was already in place before it occurred. A long silence followed. Mrs. Blackthorne rose. You have built a most elaborate theory, Mr. Holmes, she said, her voice as calm as ever. But a theory is not proof. Holmes bowed slightly. Quite so, madam. And that is why I have taken the liberty, during our earlier examination, of securing something rather more tangible. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded paper, the same he had taken from the concealed compartment. This, said he, is a letter, one of several, which establishes not only Mr. Blackthorne's activities, but his intention to alter certain arrangements. Carraway stepped forward. Alter them? In what way? In a way that would have deprived a certain individual of both access and influence, Holmes replied. Mrs. Blackthorne's composure faltered. Only for a moment, but it was enough. Holmes's voice hardened. In short, madam, you had motive, you had opportunity, and most importantly, he took a step closer. You had already decided before the crime was committed who would be blamed for it. The room seemed to hold its breath. And now, said Sherlock Holmes quietly, we need only determine one final point. His eyes locked upon hers. How you intended never to be suspected at all. For a moment, no one spoke. The accusation, though delivered with Holmes's customary restraint, struck the room with the force of a physical blow. Even Inspector Lestrade, whose skepticism had thus far served as a shield against conjecture, stood in uncharacteristic silence, his gaze shifting from Holmes to Mrs. Blackthorne with renewed scrutiny. It was she who broke the stillness. You are very confident, Mr. Holmes. she said, her voice measured, though now lacking the effortless composure it had borne before. But confidence is not conviction, nor is denial a defense, Holmes replied calmly. She gave a faint, an almost imperceptible smile. Then perhaps you will enlighten us. You have spoken of motive, of arrangement, of some elaborate device. Yet you have not shown, cannot show, how such a crime could be executed without detection. Holmes inclined his head slightly. On the contrary, madam, I believe I can. He turned to Lestrade. Inspector, you observed the wound? I did. And you described it as consistent with a blow from the paperweight? Yes, but not conclusively so. Lestrade hesitated. It was possible by other means. Holmes nodded. Precisely. A small, concentrated force, delivered at a specific angle, not necessarily by a hand, nor even in close proximity. He moved slowly toward the center of the room, as though reconstructing the scene before us. Imagine, if you will, Mr. Blackthorne, seated at his desk, engaged in reading or writing. He is unaware of immediate danger. There is no struggle, no alarm. At a precise moment, a mechanism, concealed, prepared in advance, delivers a single, targeted blow to the back of the head. Carraway stared. But such a thing, how could it be arranged? Holmes's eyes flicked briefly toward the study door. With ingenuity, said he, and with access. He turned once more to Mrs. Blackthorne. You had both. She did not answer. Holmes continued, his voice gaining a sharper edge. The marks upon the carpet indicate that an object was placed beneath or beside the desk, an object with two narrow points of contact. It remained there long enough to perform its function, and was then removed. And you believe this object to be your so-called device? Lestrade said. I do. A compact apparatus, spring-driven perhaps, capable of delivering a controlled impact when triggered. Such devices are not unknown. They are used in certain industrial applications, adapted in this case to a far more sinister purpose. And how was it triggered? I asked. Holmes glanced at me with approval. An excellent question, Watson, for that is the crux of the matter. He paused, then said, remotely. A murmur passed through the room. Remotely, Lestrade repeated. You mean by a wire? A string? Possibly. Or by a timed release. The exact mechanism is of less importance than its effect. The essential point is that the perpetrator need not be present at the moment of the act. Carraway's face had grown pale. Then, she could have been elsewhere in the house, or even accounted for by others, Holmes replied. Mrs. Blackthorne's composure had returned, though it was now colder, more rigid. This is speculation, she said. Ingenious, certainly, but without proof. Holmes's gaze did not waver. You are mistaken, madam. The proof lies in what you overlooked. And what is that? Holmes turned once more to Lestrade. The fire, said he. You were told that it had burned low, that Mr. Blackthorne, who was particular about such matters, allowed it to die. Yes, said Lestrade. What of it? Holmes's eyes gleamed. A man who expects to remain in his study does not allow his fire to go out. But a man who is interrupted, who is struck down suddenly, has no opportunity to tend it. That proves nothing, Lestrade said. On its own, no, Holmes agreed. But combined with the absence of struggle, the precise nature of the wound, even the presence of the device, it suggests that the act occurred not in the heat of confrontation, but as the result of prior arrangement. He turned back to Mrs. Blackthorne. You did not need to be present when your cousin died. You needed only to ensure that the conditions were in place and that the outcome would point elsewhere. Her eyes flashed. And yet you cannot produce this device of yours. Holmes smiled faintly. No, because you removed it. And where is it now? Holmes's expression hardened. That, madam, is the one element you could not fully control. He stepped closer, his voice lowering. "For in removing it, you left traces, those marks upon the carpet which no one else thought to examine. You relied upon the completeness of your design to obscure its mechanism. You assumed that no one would look beyond the obvious." A long silence followed. "And now," Holmes continued, "we return to the final question, how you intended never to be suspected." He reached once more into his pocket and withdrew the papers. "These documents show that Mr. Blackthorne intended to alter his arrangements, to withdraw certain privileges, to limit access, and perhaps to expose matters that would have been inconvenient." Carraway drew a sharp breath. "You mean he was about to act against her?" Holmes inclined his head. "A motive, then, not merely for resentment, but for urgency. The crime had to be committed before those changes took effect." Mrs. Blackthorne stood very still. "And so," Holmes said quietly, "you devised a plan in which the crime would appear both inevitable and already solved. And you selected your suspect in advance, arranged the evidence, and ensured that by the time the truth was questioned, it would already be buried beneath certainty." Lestrade took a step forward. "Mrs. Blackthorne," he said, his voice now firm, "you will have to account for these matters." She looked from one face to another, Holmes, Lestrade, Carraway, and finally me. There was no longer any trace of uncertainty in her expression. Instead, there was something else, something colder and far more resolute. "You believe you have uncovered everything," she said. Holmes met her gaze. "I believe," said he, "that we have uncovered enough." She smiled then, a faint, enigmatic smile that sent a chill through me. "Then perhaps," she said softly, "it is time you learned how incomplete your conclusions truly are." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "Oh?" said he. And in that instant I felt, though I could not yet explain why, that the case, far from being resolved, had taken one final and unexpected turn. Holmes did not move, though I saw at once that every faculty within him had sharpened to its keenest edge. The faint smile upon Mrs. Blackthorne's lips was not one of defeat, nor even of defiance. It was something far more disquieting, the expression of a mind that still retained one final advantage. "Incomplete?" Holmes repeated softly. "Yes," she said. "You have constructed a narrative, impressive, intricate, and almost correct. But you have made one assumption upon which everything else depends." "And that is?" "That I require this elaborate mechanism you describe." A flicker of something, interest, perhaps even satisfaction, passed across Holmes's face. "Pray continue," said he. "So, you believe," she went on, "that the crime was committed by means of a device, something placed, used, and removed. You have based this upon the marks upon the carpet, the nature of the wound, and the absence of struggle." "Those are the facts," Holmes replied. "They are observations," she corrected. "And observations, Mr. Holmes, are only as reliable as the interpretation placed upon them." Lestrade shifted impatiently. "If you have something to say, madam, you'd best say it plainly." She turned to him with quiet composure. "Very well, Inspector. The truth is much simpler than Mr. Holmes would have you believe." Holmes's eyes did not leave her face. "Simplicity," said he, "is often the final refuge of the ingenious." She ignored the remark. "There was no device," she said. "No hidden mechanism, no remote trigger. My cousin died exactly as it appears he did, by a blow delivered from behind." A murmur passed through the room. Holmes spoke at once. "And yet you do not deny your involvement." She met his gaze steadily. "I do not deny that I ensured the outcome." Carraway gave a strangled exclamation. "You admit it?" "I admit," she said calmly, "that Julius Blackthorne's death was neither accidental nor unforeseen." Lestrade stepped forward. "Then you will come with me." "Not yet," Holmes said sharply. There was something in his tone that arrested even Lestrade's advance. "Madam," Holmes continued, "if there was no device, Then we are left with a contradiction. The marks upon the carpet were not made by any instrument of death, she interrupted. Then by what? She was silent for a moment, as though considering how much to reveal. And then she said, by something that was present before the act, and removed afterward, for reasons entirely unrelated to the manner of the crime. Holmes's eyes narrowed. The dispatch box, he said. She inclined her head slightly. Partly. Explain. She drew a breath, and for the first time there was the faintest trace of strain in her voice. My cousin did not trust anyone, not even those within his own house. He kept his most sensitive papers in more than one place. The box upon the mantel was a decoy. The true documents, those of greatest value, were concealed elsewhere. In the desk, Holmes said quietly. Yes. And you knew this? I discovered it, she replied. Not long before his death. Holmes's expression remained intent. Go on. He intended to act upon those documents, to alter arrangements that would have affected me, and I could not allow that. So you resolved to act first? Yes. And you chose Mr. Vane as your scapegoat. He was convenient, she said coldly, and already under suspicion. Holmes nodded slowly. Then we returned to the central question. How was the act itself accomplished? She held his gaze. I struck him. The words fell with quiet finality. Lestrade stepped forward again. That's enough. Wait, Holmes said. He was studying her now with renewed intensity, as though testing her statement against the evidence already assembled. You struck him, he repeated, and yet there was no sign of struggle, no defensive wound, no indication that he was aware of your presence. He was not, she said. How do you account for that? A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. I did not approach him as an enemy. Holmes's eyes flickered. You mean, I entered the study openly. We spoke. He turned from me, dismissively, as was his habit. And in that moment, she made a slight gesture with her hand. It required very little. Holmes was silent. And the paperweight? He asked at last. I used it, she said, but not as you suppose. The blow was delivered swiftly. The rest, she paused, was arrangement. Holmes's gaze sharpened. You mean the staging? Yes. The disorder, the placement of the object, the removal of the documents. All of it was done afterward. And the marks upon the carpet? She hesitated, then said, the box, the real one. It was not upon the mantel, but beneath the desk. I removed it, placed it briefly upon the floor while I gathered the contents, and then took it with me. Holmes's expression changed, subtly, but unmistakably. The marks, he said softly, were not from a device, but from the box itself. Yes. And he gave a faint, almost amused exhalation. I mistook their significance. For the first time since I had known him, I saw Holmes acknowledge an error, not in fact, but in interpretation. You see, she said quietly, even the most careful observer may be misled. If the scene has been arranged with sufficient care. Holmes inclined his head. Indeed. Lestrade stepped forward once more, his patience now exhausted. Mrs. Blackthorne, I must ask you to... But Holmes raised a hand. One moment more, if you please. Lestrade hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Holmes stepped closer to her. You have accounted for much, he said, but not everything. Her eyes flickered. The key, he said. A silence fell. The key was placed upon the inside of the door after the room was secured. You could not have done that if you left by the door. For the first time, she did not answer at once. Holmes's voice grew quieter. Nor could you have remained within, for you were seen elsewhere shortly afterward. She drew a slow breath. No, she said. Then how? Holmes pressed. Her composure returned, but now it bore the unmistakable strain of final resistance. "You have come this far, Mr. Holmes," she said. "Surely you can complete the puzzle." Holmes regarded her for a long moment. Then, very slowly, a light kindled in his eyes. "Ah," he murmured. He turned to me. "The window, Watson." I felt a sudden thrill of comprehension. "The scratches upon the sill." "Exactly," said Holmes. He looked back at Mrs. Blackthorne. "And you left by the window, secured it behind you, and then replaced the key from the outside, by means of a simple manipulation." She said nothing. Holmes inclined his head. "A most elegant solution." Lestrade stepped forward decisively. "Mrs. Blackthorne, I must ask you to come with me." This time she did not resist. As she passed Holmes, she paused. "You were very nearly correct," she said softly. Holmes met her gaze. "Very nearly," he agreed. And as she was led from the room, I could not help but feel that I had witnessed not merely the resolution of a crime, but a contest of minds in which even the smallest misstep might have altered the outcome entirely. Holmes remained standing for some time after she had gone, his expression thoughtful. "Well, Watson," said he at last, "a case closed in advance. But not, I think, as intended. And though the truth had at last been brought to light, I sensed that its path had been far narrower and far more perilous than even Holmes himself had anticipated." The departure of Mrs. Blackthorne left behind a silence of a very different character from that which had preceded her exposure. It was no longer the tense stillness of uncertainty, but rather the quiet aftermath of revelation, when each mind present labors to rearrange the past in light of the truth newly uncovered. Inspector Lestrade was the first to recover his voice. "Well," said he, with a short exhalation, "I'll admit, Holmes, you've turned it neatly enough, though I'd have had her in the end." Holmes gave a faint, non-committal smile. "No doubt, Lestrade. Though I venture it might have taken rather longer and cost an innocent man his liberty in the meantime." Lestrade cleared his throat. "We work with what we have." "And sometimes," Holmes replied gently, "what we have has been arranged for us." Carroway, who had remained seated throughout the final exchange, now rose unsteadily to his feet. "Then it is finished?" he asked. "Mr. Vane will be released?" "He must be," said Lestrade. "There's no case left against him, not with this confession." Holmes shook his head slightly. "Not merely the confession, Lestrade. The structure itself collapses. Once it is shown that the evidence was deliberately arranged, its value is nullified. The chain is broken." Carroway passed a hand across his face. "Extraordinary. To think that it was all decided beforehand, that the conclusion was fixed before the crime was even committed." Holmes turned toward him. "Not fixed," said he. "Prepared. There is a difference. The outcome still required execution, but every effort was made to ensure that, once achieved, it would admit of only one interpretation." "And yet," I said, "it did not." Holmes glanced at me with a trace of warmth. "No, Watson, because even the most carefully constructed design must ultimately contend with reality, and reality has a habit of leaving traces." He moved slowly toward the window, looking out upon the grey afternoon, where the fog had at last begun to lift, revealing the outlines of the street beyond with increasing clarity. "It is curious," he continued, "how often the smallest detail proves decisive, and a faint mark upon a carpet, a misplaced assumption, a key observed too closely, or not closely enough. Each is insignificant in isolation, yet together they form the thread by which the truth may be drawn forth." I could not help but smile. "And yet even you, Holmes, were, if I may say so, momentarily misled." He turned, and there was in his expression no trace of irritation, only a quiet acknowledgment. "Quite so, Watson. I allowed the elegance of the pattern to seduce me into an over-elaborate explanation. I saw design and assumed complexity, when in fact the design lay in simplicity. The device, I said. A phantom of my own construction, Holmes replied. The marks were real, but their meaning was not what I first supposed. It is a salutary reminder that one must never permit theory to outrun fact. Lestrade gave a short laugh. Well, I'll take a straightforward case over one of your theoretical puzzles any day. Holmes inclined his head. And yet it was precisely the apparent straightforwardness of this case which rendered it dangerous. Carroway stepped forward, his expression earnest. Mr. Holmes, I cannot adequately express my gratitude. Without your intervention— Holmes raised a hand lightly. My dear sir, you observed the essential inconsistency yourself. It was your refusal to accept the obvious that set this inquiry in motion. I merely followed where the facts led. Carroway bowed his head. Even so, I am in your debt. Holmes's gaze softened slightly. If you wish to discharge it, then remember this. Whenever a matter appears too perfectly resolved, it is wise to ask not only whether it is true, but whether it has been made to appear so. Carroway nodded slowly. I shall not forget it. A constable entered briefly to inform Lestrade that arrangements had been made and that Mrs. Blackthorne had been conveyed into custody. With a final nod to Holmes, the inspector took his leave, his earlier confidence replaced by a more measured respect. When we were at last alone, Holmes reached for his coat. Come, Watson, said he. The air grows clearer, and I find I've had quite enough of this house. We stepped out into the late afternoon, the chill still sharp, but the oppressive fog now broken into drifting remnants. The world seemed, in some subtle way, restored to order. As we made our way back toward Baker Street, I could not help but reflect upon the peculiar nature of the case. It is a singular thing, I said, that a crime should be designed not merely to succeed, but to be solved, and solved incorrectly. Holmes gave a soft chuckle. Ah, Watson, there you touch upon its most interesting aspect. The criminal mind, when sufficiently advanced, does not merely seek to evade detection, it seeks to direct it, to provide answers in place of questions, to close the case before it is even opened. And yet, I said, it failed. Holmes glanced at me sidelong. Not entirely. It succeeded in every respect, save one. And what was that? He paused, then said, It did not account for the possibility that someone might look beyond the answer. We walked on in silence for a time, the rhythm of our steps echoing faintly along the pavement. At length, Holmes spoke again, more lightly. I think, Watson, that we may consider this matter concluded. And now, if you are not otherwise engaged, I should be glad of your company at dinner. I find that the exercise of the faculties, though invigorating, tends to produce a most unphilosophical appetite. I laughed. With pleasure. Holmes's expression grew thoughtful once more, though the edge of tension had gone from it. A case closed in advance, he murmured. An ingenious idea, but ultimately flawed. For truth, my dear Watson, has one quality which no human design can fully anticipate. And that is, Holmes smiled faintly, it persists. And with that, we turned once more toward Baker Street, leaving behind us a mystery that had nearly succeeded in concealing itself, and carrying with us, as ever, a renewed appreciation for the delicate balance between appearance and reality.